we should reintroduce bin Laden and al-Qaeda to the story now, because it is in the mid-90s, after Osama bin Laden is essentially forced to leave the Sudan, that needing a place to set up camp, he finds a friendly reception in Afghanistan. And we hear later that the Afghans have to maintain this relationship with him because of issues of tribal hospitality and honor, and so on and so forth. To what extent was the emergence of this relationship between the newly arrived bin Laden and his al-Qaeda cohort and the Taliban, to what extent was that essentially a marriage of convenience at the beginning, or was there a real identity of interests at that time between these two as bin Laden creates this plan for the global jihad? Did this fit into the Taliban's ambitions for itself?
I think initially it did not, in the sense that I think that al-Qaeda and bin Laden in particular found a welcoming home initially in eastern Afghanistan because of the very long ties that they had going back through the Soviet War. There certainly wasn't a clash of interests, but I don't think that the Afghans were, again, looking to be part of some broader picture. I think what they saw was a person who had supported them, who had an enormous amount of money to throw around. I mean, there is a certain degree of bin Laden sort of, I think, at the time and subsequently bribing his way into the Afghan political networks. It really wasn't until bin Laden started to, I think in many ways, tutor Mullah Omar, and not only bin Laden, but Ayman al-Zawahiri as well, that they became, they stoked Mullah Omar's vision of himself as a prophet, that he was creating a caliphate that was along the lines of what the Prophet Muhammad would have wanted. They had this country, Afghanistan, in many ways somewhat pre-modern, where they could impose any kind of rules that they wanted to. And so I think that they, in many ways, played deeply into Mullah Omar's vanity of having a state of his own that was that bin Laden could support.
What can you describe in terms of the relationship between the strategies of al-Qaeda as they emerge in the declarations of war against the U.S. in '96 and '98, the bombings of the USS Cole and the embassies in Africa? What was the Taliban's view of this? Were they complicit in it? Did they help in the planning? Or were they learning of these things after the fact?
I'm not sure that the answer to that question is fully known, and I don't know the answer. It would be fascinating to know. What I understand from information, both from people who were in the Taliban at the time, who've subsequently talked about it, is that in many ways what bin Laden was doing abroad was not related to the Taliban. The Taliban certainly knew about them and came to know about them, and the United States government did send cruise missiles into Afghanistan in 1998 in response to the embassy bombings. And so the Taliban became increasingly aware that they were harboring bin Laden and al-Qaeda, and that they were engaged in these attacks abroad. What is not clear to me is the extent to which the Taliban knew of or even supported those. We've heard, and again, it's hard to know the truth of it, it may be people going back and revising, people who were with the Taliban, who talk about splits within the Taliban and not wanting bin Laden to be associated with the Taliban. I mean, well before 9/11, with these other incidents that you talk about, there was a great deal of sensitivity, and the United States did attempt through back channels to communicate to the Taliban that we wanted bin Laden, and we wouldn't tolerate their support for bin Laden. But bin Laden really became increasingly intertwined, particularly with Mullah Omar. Their families intermarried, and at some point I think that Mullah Omar felt very close to bin Laden. Ideologically, he felt supported. I think that bin Laden, in many ways, took the role of playing to Mullah Omar's vision of himself as a great leader and as a prophet.
Well, bin Laden actually pledged his loyalty to Mullah Omar. So this notion of Mullah Omar as global caliph is not just fanciful in his mind. It's something that Osama bin Laden supported.
Right. Although in some ways I think is a reversal of the power dynamic, in that I think that obviously bin Laden had much greater visions and in many ways was the one sort of pulling those psychological strings.